This week, the rain beat him. Zandvoort ended in the barriers on lap 1, on a damp patch in his own final home race. But across a decade of racing, it hasn't always gone that way, not even close. Because when the sky opens up, when grip disappears entirely, and everyone else on the grid starts visibly backing off, Max Verstappen has spent a decade being the one driver everyone else is genuinely afraid of racing against. Brazil, 2016, the rookie Masterclass Interlagos, his debut season, conditions severe enough to wreck half the grid's afternoon entirely. Cars sliding off at every single corner of the circuit as the rain kept getting heavier by the lap. Verstappen was buried outside the top 15 in a Toro Rosso that had no business finishing anywhere near the podium. Then the rain intensified further, visibility dropping to almost nothing down the main straight, and something in his driving simply switched on, like a different gear nobody knew he had access to yet. Lap after lap, in conditions where most of the field was genuinely just trying to survive without crashing, he found grip nobody else on the grid could find, picking off car after car with a level of control that looked almost unfair for a driver still in his first year in the sport. By the checkered flag, he'd carved his way from outside the top 15 all the way to third place, a result still referenced today, years later, as one of the greatest wet-weather drives this sport has ever produced. He wasn't even old enough to legally drink in most countries when he did it. Hockenheim, 2019. Controlling the chaos. Germany, 3 years later, and this one wasn't a recovery drive from the back. It was total command of a race that absolutely nobody else on the grid could control. Rain fell from the start and kept falling steadily, forcing every single car on the grid onto full wet tires behind the safety car for the opening laps. Verstappen made a poor getaway and spent the early laps stuck behind the Mercedes pair, patient, waiting for his moment rather than forcing anything. When the track began to dry unevenly, he made the gamble to switch to slick mediums earlier than most of the field dared to, and it paid off completely, vaulting him to the front as Lewis Hamilton, who'd looked genuinely untouchable in the lead, slid off at the penultimate corner chasing that exact same window a few laps too late. Verstappen even survived a full 360-degree spin in the stadium section and still brought it home, winning by over 7 seconds after 5 separate pit stops in a race that genuinely ate nearly everyone else on the grid alive. Christian Horner's verdict afterward was blunt. Verstappen was in a class of his own. Imola 2021. The move itself. And then there's the one everyone actually remembers when they picture Verstappen in the wet. Third on the grid, lights out on a genuinely soaking track, and by the time the field reached the first corner complex at Tamburello, barely a few hundred meters into the race, he was already alongside pole-sitter Lewis Hamilton on the outside line. Verstappen took the inside line through the chicane, held his nerve completely as Hamilton tried to hang on around him, and came out of Tamburello in the lead, with Hamilton thudding hard over the curbs behind him, losing parts of his front wing in the process. It's one of the cleanest, most complete overtakes of his entire career, executed in near-zero visibility against the fastest driver of his generation, on the opening lap, before most of the grid had even settled into any kind of rhythm at all. Verstappen led almost the entire distance of the race from that single moment onward, and won it comfortably by 22 seconds. Okay, before we go any further, make sure you're smashing that hype button, because the next one might be the most famous of them all. São Paulo, 2024, 17th to 1st. If the first 3 drives happened years apart, this one happened in the middle of a title fight he was, at the time, actually losing on points. A wrecked wet qualifying session left him down in 17th on the grid at Interlagos, in front of a title rival who'd qualified miles ahead of him, the kind of result that should have ended any realistic hope of closing the gap this late in the season. Instead, in mixed and constantly changing conditions, sometimes dry, sometimes soaked, sometimes somewhere in between from one lap to the next, Verstappen produced one of the single most complete drives of his entire career, picking his way through car after car with total precision and genuinely zero mistakes across the entire race distance. He crossed the finish line in first place, 17th to 1st, in one single race. During the exact stretch of the season, everyone had already started writing him off. It became one of the defining, title-shaping drives of his championship run that year. The kind of result that swings momentum far beyond the points it actually gives out. And it's proof this isn't just an old highlight reel from early in his career. It's a pattern that's still happening right now in the current era of the sport. Because for every overtake that ends up in a highlight reel somewhere, there are dozens of smaller moments that never do. The snaps caught mid-corner with a single flick of correction, the half-spins gathered up before they ever become a full crash, the no-lift commitments through standing water on a blind approach that could have ended a race in an instant but simply didn't. These are the moments that actually separate a driver who's fast in the wet from a driver who's genuinely safe in the wet, the split-second corrections that never generate a single headline, because, by definition, nothing went wrong. Across a decade of wet sessions, on circuit after circuit, that pattern repeats itself over and over, quietly, without anyone ever having to write about it. Because the alternative version of events, the one where he doesn't catch it, simply hasn't happened often enough across that decade to become the story anyone tells. Put these 4 drives together, spanning nearly a decade of his career from teenager to champion, and you get 4 completely different kinds of wet weather mastery, not one repeated trick performed over and over for the cameras. Brazil 2016 was a teenager finding raw speed nobody else on that grid could access. Hockenheim 2019 was patience combined with a perfectly timed strategic gamble. Imola 2021 was pure, surgical precision, one decisive move that effectively won the race in its opening seconds. São Paulo 2024 was something different again. Sustained, mistake-free precision across an entire wrecked weekend, with the championship actually on the line. 4 genuinely different skills, spread across 4 different years, from teenage rookie to reigning champion, and one single driver responsible for every one of them. That's not luck simply showing up 4 separate times across the same career, coincidentally, in 4 unrelated races. That's a genuine, repeatable pattern that's followed him through nearly every single era of his career so far, right up to the present one. This week's conditions didn't go his way, and that's a real, honest disappointment for a driver at his own farewell race. But history, a decade of it, says that result is the exception here, not the rule. Subscribe for the full Untouchable series, because this is genuinely only the wet weather chapter. There's a lot more of this decade still to cover. Which one of these 4 was actually his best rain drive of all? Brazil, Hockenheim, Imola, or São Paulo? Tell us in the comments below. Smash that hype button, and we'll see you at the next one.